The alien queen, Zarina, stood in the dimly lit chamber of her royal starship, her violet eyes shimmering with frustration. Her people, the Syrians, were a proud and advanced species, but they faced a dire problem: extinction. Zarina herself carried the burden of their survival, as their genetics required a specific catalyst to trigger reproduction. The problem: that catalyst existed only within human DNA. She had resisted this notion for cycles, but her council insisted there was no other way. She needed a human, and she needed him now. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the bustling dockyard. Crates of cargo lined the pier, workers shouting instructions as forklifts zipped past. Among the organized chaos, a lone figure leaned casually against a stack of containers, a tattered duffel bag by his side. His presence was unassuming: a lean man with a weathered leather jacket, buzzed hair, and the quiet demeanor of someone used to being overlooked. No one paid him much attention. His name was Nate, and he was a soldier recently returned from a long deployment overseas. He wasn't there for trouble, only waiting for the cargo ship that carried the rest of his belongings from his last post. Yet trouble, as it often does, had a way of finding him. The sound of roaring engines broke through the rhythmic clang of metal and the occasional squawk of seagulls. A group of bikers rolled in, their motorcycles gleaming under the fading sunlight. There were 5 of them, dressed in leather vests adorned with patches and skull motifs, their laughter loud and mocking. They parked their bikes in a semicircle near Nate, the loud revving of engines drawing annoyed glances from the dock workers. Nate didn't flinch or even glance their way, though he couldn't help but notice their brash arrival. The leader, a burly man with a shaved head and a tattoo snaking up his neck, sauntered over. His name, according to the patch on his vest, was Crusher. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never met resistance he couldn't crush, just as his nickname implied. When Captain Jack Harris was abducted from his ship, he had no idea what he was walking, or rather, being dragged into. Jack was rugged, sarcastic, and not exactly diplomatic material, but his charm was undeniable. He woke up in a chamber that could only be described as both futuristic and disturbingly intimate. The walls pulsed with a soft blue glow, and the air was thick with a floral scent that seemed to cling to his skin. Before he could make a witty remark about his predicament, Zarina entered, her presence commanding yet oddly vulnerable. Crusher sized Nate up, smirking as he approached. "Hey, soldier boy," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You look lost. This ain't the place for quiet types." His buddies laughed, one of them pretending to stumble as if Nate's mere presence had thrown him off balance. Nate didn't respond, his eyes scanning the horizon, keeping his breathing steady. Crusher didn't take kindly to being ignored. He stepped closer, his boots scuffing the concrete, and reached out to grab Nate's shoulder. The move was quick, but Nate was quicker. Before the biker's hand could make contact, Nate shifted, sidestepping and turning in one fluid motion. Crusher found himself gripping air, his hand closing on nothing. The gang erupted in laughter, but it wasn't the kind Crusher appreciated. Zarina was unlike any being Jack had encountered. Her tall, lithe frame shimmered with an iridescent hue, and her voice carried a melodic tone that was both soothing and enticing. She explained her predicament with a mix of authority and desperation, her words carefully chosen but laced with unspoken tension. Jack, ever the joker, smirked. "So, let me get this straight. You need me to save your species? This isn't some weird alien dating show, is it?" Crusher's face darkened, and he clenched his fists, clearly not used to being embarrassed in front of his crew. "You think you're funny, huh?" he growled, stepping into Nate's personal space. Nate finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "I'm not looking for trouble. Just waiting for my shipment." His tone wasn't confrontational, but it carried an edge of warning that even Crusher couldn't miss. The rest of the bikers, sensing an opportunity for entertainment, began circling the two like sharks around prey. One of them kicked at Nate's duffel bag, sending it skidding a few feet. "Oops," the man sneered. Nate's gaze flicked to the bag, then back to Crusher, who was now grinning, his confidence seemingly restored. Zarina's composure faltered for a brief moment, her cheeks glowing a faint silver, a sign of embarrassment, Jack assumed. "Your DNA carries a sequence that can awaken our dormant reproductive cycle," she said, her gaze fixed on him. "This is not about pleasure, human. It is about survival." Jack leaned back, crossing his arms. "Not about pleasure, her. Could have fooled me with this setup. What's next? Candlelight dinner. You think you're tough, Crusher taunted. Bet you've never seen a real fight. All that military training doesn't mean squat here. Nate didn't respond, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his stance relaxed but balanced. The bikers took this as a sign of weakness. One of them, a wiry guy with a scar running down his cheek, lunged at Nate, clearly intending to shove him. What happened next was so fast that even the bikers watching weren't entirely sure what they'd seen. Nate sidestepped again, his hand shooting out to grab the man's wrist. With a swift, precise motion he twisted, and the biker found himself on his knees, yelping in pain as Nate released him just as quickly. The dockyard workers had started to take notice, their chatter growing quieter as they turned to watch the unfolding scene. Crusher's grin vanished, replaced by a scowl. "You think you can mess with us?" He snarled. He gestured to the rest of his crew, who moved to surround Nate. This time Nate's posture changed. He shifted his weight slightly, his feet planting firmly on the ground, his hands coming up in a loose guard. The bikers advanced as a group, and Nate moved like a man who had done this many times before. His movements were efficient, almost clinical, as he ducked, weaved, and countered. A punch came his way, and he blocked it with ease, delivering a quick jab to the attacker's ribs that left the man gasping. Another lunged with a wild swing, only to find himself flipped onto his back in a single fluid motion. Zarina's expression hardened, but her glowing cheeks betrayed her flustered state. "You misunderstand. This is a sacred duty." "Sacred, huh? Well, I'm all about helping endangered species," Jack said, his grin widening. "But you might want to buy me a drink first." The fight wasn't flashy, but it was effective. Within moments, 3 of the bikers were on the ground, groaning and clutching various parts of their bodies. The remaining 2 hesitated, their confidence shaken. Crusher, however, was not one to back down, not in front of an audience. He pulled a chain from his belt, the metal links clinking ominously as he swung it in an arc. "You're going to regret this, soldier boy," he spat, charging at Nate with the chain swinging wildly. Nate didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance faster than Crusher expected. He grabbed the chain mid-swing, yanking it from Crusher's grasp with a strength that took the larger man by surprise. Before Crusher could react, Nate delivered a swift kick to the side of his knee, sending him sprawling. The dockyard was silent now, the workers watching in awe as the man who had seemed so unassuming moments ago stood tall, his gaze sweeping over the fallen bikers. Nate's breathing was steady, his composure unshaken. He dropped the chain at Crusher's feet, his message clear: he wasn't interested in finishing the fight unless they forced his hand. The bikers, bruised and battered, scrambled to their feet, their bravado replaced with a mix of fear and humiliation. Crusher glared at Nate, his jaw working as if trying to come up with a parting shot that would save face. But no words came. Instead, he turned, motioning for his crew to follow. They limped back to their bikes, revving the engines loudly as if to drown out their defeat, and sped off into the evening. The Queen's patience was clearly wearing thin, but Jack wasn't done pushing her buttons. He found her mix of regal authority and awkward vulnerability amusing, and he couldn't resist teasing her. Yet, beneath his playful demeanor, he couldn't ignore the weight of her words. If what she said was true, then he was the key to saving an entire civilization. Nate watched them go, his expression unreadable. One of the dock workers, a burly man with grease-streaked overalls, approached cautiously. "You all right, man?" he asked, his tone a mix of admiration and curiosity. Nate nodded, picking up his duffel bag and slinging it over his shoulder. "Yeah," he replied simply. "Just another day," the worker chuckled, shaking his head. "Remind me never to mess with you." Nate allowed himself a small smile before turning back to the dock, his focus returning to the ship that had just begun to unload cargo. The dockyard buzzed with activity again, the workers going back to their tasks, though more than a few stole glances at Nate, now seeing him in a very different light. Zarina stepped closer, her gaze locking onto his. "This is not a matter for jest. Time is running out, and I require your cooperation." Jack's grin faded slightly as he saw the sincerity in her eyes. All right," he said, raising his hands in mock surrender. "I'll help. But let's set some ground rules. No weird alien experiments, and definitely no tentacles." The sun dipped further below the horizon, casting the dockyard into shades of orange and purple. The workers returned to their routines, but the air was charged with the unspoken energy of what had just transpired. Nate remained in his spot, quiet and still, as if the scuffle had never happened. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, his gaze shifting toward the ship, where his belongings were still being unloaded. For Nate, the encounter with the bikers was already a distant memory. His training had taught him to compartmentalize moments like these, to let them roll off like water. But the dock workers kept glancing his way, murmuring amongst themselves. It didn't take long for the murmurs to attract attention from others around the dock. A tall man in a crisp white shirt and dark slacks, clearly a manager or foreman, approached Nate. His name tag read Collins, and he carried a clipboard that he tapped nervously against his thigh. "Excuse me," Collins began, his voice tight but polite. "I saw what happened back there. Those guys have been causing trouble around here for weeks. Frankly, we've been waiting for someone to put them in their place." Nate didn't respond immediately, his eyes still focused on the ship. After a pause, he glanced at Collins and gave a slight nod, acknowledging the compliment but offering no further commentary. Collins hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. "Well," he added, "if you ever need a favor, let me know. Not every day we get someone around here who can handle themselves like that." Zarina tilted her head, clearly puzzled. "Tentacles. Humans have peculiar imaginations." Jack chuckled. "You have no idea." Nate didn't linger on the conversation. Once his duffel bag was safely secured, he made his way toward a quieter section of the dock. He had no intention of sticking around longer than necessary. Trouble had a way of following him, and he wasn't interested in becoming a local hero or, worse, a target. But just as he thought the day's events were behind him, the sound of motorcycles in the distance made him stop in his tracks. The roar was faint but growing louder, and Nate instinctively scanned his surroundings. The bikers were coming back, and from the sound of it, they weren't alone this time. The Queen gestured toward a platform in the center of the room. It was adorned with intricate symbols that seemed to shift and glow as she approached. "This is the Nexus chamber," she explained. "Our genetic compatibility will be tested here. It is a delicate process." Within minutes, the group rolled into view. This time there were more of them, at least a dozen bikes, their engines growling like a pack of wolves closing in on prey. Crusher was at the head of the pack, his face twisted with anger. The humiliation from earlier still burned fresh, and he wasn't about to let it go unanswered. The dock workers scattered, some ducking behind crates while others retreated into nearby warehouses. Collins, who had been speaking with Nate only moments before, backed away quickly, his expression a mix of fear and disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath before disappearing into an office. Jack followed her, his usual swagger replaced with cautious curiosity. As he stepped onto the platform, he couldn't help but notice how close Zarina was standing. Her scent and intoxicating blend of alien florals filled his senses, and he felt a strange warmth radiating from her. The bikers dismounted, their boots crunching against the gravel as they fanned out in a loose formation. Crusher stepped forward, flanked by two particularly menacing figures, one a towering man with arms like tree trunks, the other a wiry guy with a knife strapped to his belt. Crusher's grin was smug, his confidence bolstered by the reinforcements. "Thought you could humiliate me and get away with it?" "Ha," he called out, his voice echoing across the dockyard. Nate remained where he was, his posture relaxed but alert. He didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Crusher's grin faltered slightly at Nate's silence, but he pressed on, motioning to his crew. "This here's my family," he said, his tone taking on a mocking edge. "And we don't take kindly to disrespect. You've got two choices, Soldier Boy, kneel and apologize, or we make you regret ever setting foot on this dock." The other bikers laughed, their voices a cacophony of jeers and threats. Nate's expression didn't change. His mind was already calculating, assessing the numbers, the terrain, and the potential outcomes. He had faced worse odds in far less forgiving circumstances. "So, how does this work?" he asked, trying to keep his tone light. "Do we shake hands, or is it more of a full-body experience?" The tension hung thick in the air, the bikers waiting for Nate's response. When none came, Crusher's patience snapped. "Get him," he barked, and the group surged forward like a wave. Nate moved. His training kicked in, every motion precise and deliberate. He sidestepped the first attacker, a burly man who swung wildly, and delivered a sharp elbow to his ribs. The man crumpled with a grunt, and Nate was already moving to intercept the next. The wiry biker with the knife lunged, but Nate's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground as the man yelped in pain, stumbling backward. Zarina's silver glow intensified, and she looked away. The process involves direct contact. It is intimate. Jack raised an eyebrow. Intimate, huh? You sure you're not just making this up to get me alone? The fight was chaotic but brief. Nate's movements were a blur, each strike efficient and calculated. He used the environment to his advantage, dodging behind crates and using the biker's momentum against them. A loud crack echoed as one of Crusher's reinforcements collided with a metal beam, courtesy of Nate's well-placed throw. The bikers weren't used to this kind of precision. They fought with brute force and intimidation, but Nate fought with skill and discipline. It didn't take long for the group's numbers to dwindle. Their confidence faltering as one by one, they found themselves on the ground. Zarina shot him a withering look, but there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. Humans are insufferable, she muttered, though her tone lacked venom. As the process began, the platform pulsed with a soft light, and Jack felt a strange energy coursing through him. Zarina placed her hands on his chest, her touch surprisingly warm. Their eyes met, and for a moment the playful banter was replaced with a quiet intensity. Jack felt his heart race, though whether it was from the alien technology or the closeness of the Queen, he wasn't sure. The connection between them deepened, and Jack could sense Zarina's emotions, her fear, her hope, and a vulnerability she tried desperately to hide. It was overwhelming, yet oddly exhilarating. He realized that beneath her regal facade, she was just as uncertain as he was. And maybe, just maybe, that made this crazy situation a little less daunting. Jack, Zarina said softly, her voice trembling slightly. I need you to focus. This process requires your full cooperation. Jack smirked, trying to mask his own nerves. Don't worry, Your Majesty. I'm all in. The light around them intensified, and Jack felt a strange, tingling sensation spreading through his body. Zarina's hands remained on his chest, her touch firm yet gentle. He couldn't help but notice the way her gaze softened as the connection deepened. So he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Does this mean we're officially compatible?" Zarina's lips curved into a faint smile. "You are impossible human." Jack chuckled, but his laughter faded as the process reached its climax. The energy between them surged, and for a brief moment Jack felt as if he were floating in a sea of light. When it was over, the room fell silent, the soft glow of the platform fading to a gentle hum. Zarina stepped back, her cheeks glowing brighter than ever. "It is done," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack looked at her, a mix of curiosity and amusement in his eyes. "That's it? No fireworks? No dramatic music?" Zarina sighed, clearly exasperated. "Your humor is relentless." Jack grinned. "You know you love it." As the Queen turned to leave, Jack couldn't resist one last remark. "So, do I get a royal thank you, or is that too much to ask?" Zarina paused, glancing over her shoulder. "Perhaps. In time." Jack watched her go, a smirk on his face. He had no idea what the future held, but one thing was certain: his life had just gotten a lot more interesting. And if saving an alien queen meant more moments like this, he wasn't about to complain. Jack found himself alone in the softly glowing chamber, still standing on the now dormant platform. He looked around, half expecting some alien applause or a congratulatory banner to drop from the ceiling. "No red carpet? Tough crowd," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Whatever just happened had left him buzzing, a strange energy coursing through him. He wasn't sure if it was the alien tech or the lingering warmth from Zarina's touch, but something about it made his pulse race. Moments later, Zarina reappeared, her regal composure seemingly restored. She carried a small, crystalline device that pulsed faintly in her hands. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Is that my receipt? Or do you guys not do refunds?" The Queen's glowing cheeks gave away her embarrassment, but her tone remained firm. "This is a diagnostic tool. I must ensure the process was successful. Your humor is unnecessary." Jack leaned casually against the wall, his grin unfaltering. "Oh, come on. You can admit it. You'd miss my humor if I wasn't here." Zarina ignored his comment, stepping closer with the device. "Hold still," she ordered. Though her voice lacked the commanding edge she was clearly trying to maintain. She reached out, placing the device against his chest. The crystal flared to life, its light casting soft patterns on the walls. Jack couldn't help but notice how her hands lingered for just a moment too long. "Careful, Your Majesty," he teased. "You keep touching me like that, and I might start to think you enjoy this." Zarina's eyes narrowed, but the faint silver glow returned to her cheeks. "Your species is insufferable," she muttered, though the corners of her lips twitched ever so slightly. The device emitted a series of soft tones, and Zarina studied it intently, her brows furrowing. Jack couldn't resist leaning in a bit closer, his voice low. "So what's the verdict? Am I officially the galaxy's most eligible bachelor now?" Zarina's gaze snapped to his, her violet eyes glinting with a mix of frustration and something else Jack couldn't quite place. The process was partially successful, she admitted, her voice hesitant. "The compatibility has been established, but the results are incomplete. A secondary procedure may be necessary." Jack's grin widened. "Secondary procedure? You mean there's more? And here I thought we were done getting to know each other." Crusher watched in disbelief as his family was dismantled. His jaw clenched, and he reached for a weapon tucked into his waistband, a crowbar. "You're dead, soldier boy," he roared, charging at Nate with the makeshift weapon raised high. Nate turned to face him, his stance shifting slightly. Crusher swung with all his strength, but Nate sidestepped smoothly, grabbing the crowbar mid-swing. Using Crusher's momentum against him, Nate yanked the weapon free and spun, delivering a sharp blow to the back of Crusher's legs. The larger man went down with a pained shout, the crowbar clattering to the ground beside him. Zarina stepped back, her regal demeanor faltering for a split second. "This is not a matter for jest. The survival of my people depends on this." Jack held up his hands in mock surrender, his tone softening slightly. All right, I get it. Life and death, species on the line. I'm taking this seriously, I promise." The remaining bikers hesitated, their bravado gone. They exchanged nervous glances, clearly debating whether to press on or cut their losses. Before they could decide, the wail of sirens cut through the night air. Someone had called the police. The bikers froze, their faces a mix of fear and frustration. Crusher, still on the ground, glared up at Nate with unmasked hatred. "This ain't over," he spat, his voice hoarse. Nate didn't respond. He simply stood there, calm and unshaken, as the flashing red and blue lights drew closer. As the first patrol car pulled up, the bikers scrambled to their bikes, those who could still move hauling their injured comrades along with them. Crusher was the last to retreat, limping toward his motorcycle with one final glare at Nate. "You've made an enemy," he growled before revving his engine and speeding off with the others. The dockyard fell silent again, the only sounds the faint hum of the departing bikes and the approaching footsteps of the police officers. Nate stood motionless, his breathing steady as he watched the bikers disappear into the night. Zarina's expression softened, and she hesitated before speaking again. "The secondary procedure will require prolonged contact." Jack tilted his head, his smirk returning. "Prolonged contact, huh? Now you're just making it sound romantic." The officers approached cautiously, their hands hovering near their holsters. One of them, a middle-aged man with a grizzled beard, stepped forward. "We got a call about a disturbance," he said, his tone cautious but firm. "You all right, sir?" Nate nodded, his demeanor calm as always. "Just a misunderstanding," he replied simply. The officer studied him for a moment, then glanced at the scattered debris and the bloodied but conscious bikers still groaning on the ground. "Looks like more than a misunderstanding," he muttered, but Nate didn't elaborate. He knew the less he said, the better. The officers exchanged glances, clearly uncertain about the situation. One of them began taking notes while the other radioed for additional support. The grizzled officer returned his attention to Nate, sizing him up. "You military?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Nate didn't answer immediately. He wasn't one to advertise his background unless absolutely necessary. After a moment he gave a brief nod, his gaze steady. The officer raised an eyebrow, but whatever questions he had were left unspoken. He seemed to recognize that pressing Nate wouldn't yield anything useful. Instead, he gestured toward the dock workers peeking out from their hiding spots. Anyone here willing to talk about what happened? The Queen's glowing cheeks betrayed her once again, and she turned sharply, clearly flustered. I have preparations to make. Remain here until I return. As she disappeared through the sleek, curved doorway, Jack leaned against the wall, chuckling to himself. Prolonged contact. Yeah, I can work with that. He let his mind wander, wondering just how far this bizarre situation would go. Zarina might have been all business, but Jack could tell there was more beneath that cool, composed exterior. And if she thought he'd back down from a challenge, she clearly didn't know him very well. One of the braver workers, a wiry man in a grease-stained jumpsuit, stepped forward hesitantly. Those bikers. He began, his voice shaky but resolute. They've been harassing folks around here for weeks. Extorting money, breaking equipment, you name it. Tonight they picked the wrong guy to mess with. The worker shot Nate a grateful look, but Nate remained impassive, his focus now on the patrol cars pulling into the dockyard. A few more officers stepped out, their presence making the remaining dock workers feel bolder. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as they recounted the night's events, their stories painting Nate as an unlikely savior. Minutes later, or maybe hours, Jack wasn't sure, Zarina returned, her composure once again firmly in place. She gestured for him to follow her, and Jack obliged, unable to resist throwing one last comment her way. You know, Your Majesty, if you keep dragging me around like this, people are going to talk. The lead officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, he said, addressing his team. Get statements from everyone. We'll need to track down that biker gang. Looks like they've been causing more trouble than we thought. He turned back to Nate. You've got some moves, I'll give you that. But if these guys come after you again, call us before things get out of hand. Nate simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He wasn't worried about the bikers or their retaliation. He'd dealt with far worse in the past. As the officers began collecting statements, Nate slipped away from the commotion. The dockyard felt eerily quiet now, the earlier chaos reduced to faint echoes. He made his way to a secluded corner near the water, the rhythmic lapping of the waves offering a momentary reprieve. He leaned against a rusted metal post, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The city lights reflected on the dark water, their flickering patterns soothing in their familiarity. But Nate's mind wasn't at ease. He knew the bikers wouldn't let this go. Crusher's parting words were still fresh in his mind, and experience had taught him that men like Crusher rarely acted alone. They would regroup, plan, and come back stronger. Zarina didn't respond, though Jack noticed her glowing cheeks flare ever so slightly. The hallway they entered was lined with intricate designs, the walls pulsing faintly as if alive. It led to another chamber, this one darker and more intimate than the last. A single platform stood at its center, surrounded by softly glowing crystals. A soft sound behind him drew Nate's attention. He turned to see a young woman standing a few feet away, her hands stuffed into the pockets of a worn denim jacket. She was one of the dock workers, though Nate hadn't noticed her earlier. Her expression was a mix of curiosity and gratitude, her gaze lingering on him as if trying to piece together a puzzle. Hey, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I just wanted to say thanks. Those guys. They've been making our lives hell. You didn't have to step in, but you did. So yeah, thanks. This is the resonance chamber, Zarina explained, her voice steady. It will amplify the connection established during the initial procedure. The process requires close proximity to ensure its success. Jack raised an eyebrow, stepping onto the platform. Close proximity, huh? I think I can handle that. Nate nodded, acknowledging her gratitude but offering nothing more. The woman seemed unfazed by his silence. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning his face. You're not from around here, are you? She asked, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. Nate didn't respond. She chuckled softly, shaking her head. Figured as much. Look, if you're planning on sticking around, you should know those bikers don't just back down. Crusher's got connections, dangerous ones. I know, Nate said finally, his voice calm but firm. The woman blinked, caught off guard by his sudden response. There was something in his tone, an unshakable confidence that made her believe he wasn't just aware of the danger, he was prepared for it. She hesitated, then nodded. All right, she said, taking a step back. Just be careful, okay? This place could use someone like you. Don't let them scare you off with that." She turned and walked away, leaving Nate alone once more. Zarina joined him, her movements graceful yet hesitant. As she stood before him, Jack could see the tension in her posture. Despite her composed exterior, he could tell she wasn't as indifferent as she pretended to be. He leaned in slightly, his voice low and teasing. "Relax, Zarina. It's just me. The worst thing that happens is you end up liking me more than you planned." The night deepened, and the dockyard grew quieter as the workers finished their shifts and the police wrapped up their investigation. Nate stayed by the water, his thoughts drifting. He had no intention of staying in this city longer than necessary, but something about the situation nagged at him. The bikers were a problem, sure, but it was the dock workers, their quiet resilience, their gratitude that stuck with him. He had seen too many places where people like them were left to fend for themselves, their struggles ignored by those in power. Maybe, just maybe, he could do something about it. The Queen shot him a sharp look, though there was no real anger behind it. "You truly have no concept of restraint, do you?" Before long, the sound of approaching footsteps broke his reverie. Nate turned to see Collins, the foreman, walking toward him with a hesitant smile. "Figured I'd find you out here," Collins said, stopping a few feet away. "Wanted to thank you again. What you did tonight. Well, let's just say it's been a long time since anyone stood up to those guys." Nate didn't reply, but Collins pressed on. "Listen, I don't know what your plans are, but if you're looking for work, I could use someone like you around here. Honest pay, flexible hours." Jack shrugged, his grin unfaltering. "Not when it comes to saving a beautiful queen, no." As the chamber's lights dimmed, the platform began to hum softly, the crystals around them glowing brighter. Zarina placed her hands on Jack's shoulders, her touch firm but careful. Jack, for once, managed to hold his tongue, though the playful gleam in his eyes remained. The energy between them grew, a palpable tension filling the air. Jack couldn't help but notice how close they were, a presence both commanding and strangely comforting. Nate considered the offer. It wasn't the first time someone had offered him a job after seeing what he could do. Usually he turned them down. But this time he hesitated. The dockyard was rough, sure, but there was something about the people here, something that reminded him of the camaraderie he had once known. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Collins nodded, clearly relieved. "Take your time. Offers open as long as you need with that." He turned and walked away, leaving Nate alone once more. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Nate stood by the water, his decision still unmade. The dockyard was coming to life again, workers arriving for the morning shift, and the hum of activity filling the air. Nate knew he couldn't stay forever. His past wouldn't allow it. But for now, he would stay, just long enough to ensure that the bikers didn't come back, just long enough to remind himself that there were still places worth fighting for. The process continued, the resonance building as the crystals pulsed in time with their synchronized breathing. Jack felt a strange warmth spreading through him, the sensation both unfamiliar and oddly pleasant. Zarina's gaze locked onto his, and for a moment the banter and teasing faded away, replaced by a quiet intensity that neither of them could ignore. As the sun rose, casting a warm glow over the dockyard, Nate stood by the edge, his silhouette sharp against the golden light. He hadn't stayed in one place for so long in years. Yet this place, the people, their quiet determination had touched something in him. He knew, however, that Crusher and his gang wouldn't let the previous night's defeat go unanswered. Men like them didn't. They thrived on fear and would return, angrier and more dangerous. "You're not what I expected," Jack Zarina said softly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the chamber. By mid-afternoon, Nate was ready. He spent hours studying the dockyard, noting every corner, shadow, and possible advantage. The workers carried on with their tasks, unaware of his plans. A few cast him respectful nods, while Emma, her eyes bright with unspoken questions, watched him from a distance. Nate gave nothing away. The less they knew, the safer they would be. Jack smirked, his tone equally soft. "Yeah, I get that a lot." The hum of the resonance chamber grew louder, the air itself tingling with energy. Jack felt the weight of Zarina's hands on his shoulders, their grip tightening slightly as the crystal's glow intensified. The chamber's light cast a soft sheen on her silver hair, and her violet eyes held his gaze, unyielding yet curious. For a queen, she wasn't nearly as untouchable as she let on, and Jack couldn't resist testing those boundaries. As night fell, Nate positioned himself behind a stack of shipping containers, the perfect vantage point. The distant roar of motorcycles shattered the stillness. Crusher and his gang arrived in force, a dozen bikes tearing through the dockyard, their riders armed and menacing. Crusher's bellow carried over the yard. "Find him. We're ending this tonight." "Not what you expected, he said, his voice low and teasing. "Careful, Zarina. That almost sounded like a compliment." Her lips pressed into a thin line, though Jack caught the faintest flicker of a smile before it disappeared. "Do not flatter yourself, human. You are merely efficient for the task at hand." Nate's response was swift. One by one, he took them down with precision, moving like a shadow through the maze of containers. The gang's confidence wavered as their numbers dwindled. Crusher's fury grew, but Nate stayed in control, dictating the fight. Finally, it was just Nate and Crusher. The towering leader lunged, swinging wildly, but Nate's movements were calm and calculated. A powerful kick sent Crusher sprawling. Pinning him down, Nate's voice was cold. "This ends now. Leave this city, or next time, I won't be so merciful." Jack leaned in slightly, his grin widening. "Efficient. I've been called a lot of things, but that's a new one. What's next?" Adequate, his tone dripped with mock offense, though the twinkle in his eyes gave him away. Crusher, defeated and shaken, agreed. The gang retreated, their bikes disappearing into the night. As quiet returned, the dockyard workers emerged, their relief turning into cheers. Collins approached, gratitude written all over his face. "You saved this place. We owe you." Zarina's glowing cheeks betrayed her again, and she took a slow, deliberate breath, as if steeling herself against his relentless charm. "You misunderstand. Efficiency is crucial in matters of survival. This is not a trivial endeavor." Emma's teasing smile softened the moment. "For someone so quiet, you sure know how to make an impression." Jack raised an eyebrow, his voice softening as he took a step closer. "I get it. Life or death, big stakes. But let's not pretend this is all business, Zarina. You don't have to hide behind the Queen Act with me." Her posture stiffened, her hands dropping to her sides. "The Queen Act is who I am. My duty demands." Nate gave a rare smile but said nothing. By morning, his decision was made. As he prepared to leave, Collins tried to convince him to stay. Nate shook his head. "This isn't my place. But you'll be fine now." Emma caught him before he disappeared. "So, this is goodbye." "Your duty doesn't stop you from feeling things," Jack interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. "You're not a machine, Zarina. You're standing here, inches away, and I can tell you're just as human as me. Well, mostly." "For now," he said simply. Zarina's eyes widened for a moment, her regal composure slipping as she looked at him, truly looked at him. The chamber's glow softened and the hum quieted, leaving the two of them in an intimate stillness. Jack resisted the urge to push further, letting the silence do the work for him. As he walked away into the morning mist, the dockyard remained behind as a place transformed stronger, braver, and though Nate moved on, the sense of belonging he felt here stayed with him. For the first time in a long while, he carried a reminder that some fights weren't just worth winning, they were worth remembering. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are insufferable." Jack chuckled, the tension breaking slightly. "Yeah, but you're still here." Zarina stepped back, her movements deliberate and precise, though the glow in her cheeks betrayed her lingering fluster. "The procedure is ongoing. We must continue until the resonance stabilizes." Jack spread his arms, a playful smirk on his face. "Well, Your Majesty, if prolonged contact is what it takes, I'm all in. Don't hold back on my account." Her eyes narrowed, though there was no mistaking the faint amusement flickering in them. "You speak as though you have any control in this process." Jack tilted his head, his grin never faltering. "Oh, I've got control. Maybe not over the tech, but over you. I'm starting to think I'm getting there." Zarina's cheeks flared a brighter silver, and she turned sharply, her movements as graceful as they were defensive. "Your arrogance will be your undoing." "Arrogance, charm, same difference," Jack quipped, stepping forward to match her pace. "But hey, if it keeps you distracted, maybe I'm doing something right." The chamber's hum grew louder again, signaling the next phase of the resonance process. Zarina turned back to him, her composure somewhat restored, though her hands trembled ever so slightly as they reached for his. Jack noticed but said nothing, his usual teasing giving way to a rare moment of quiet understanding. As their hands connected, the energy between them intensified, the crystals around the room pulsing in rhythm with their joined touch. Zarina's expression softened, her violet eyes searching his face as if trying to decipher the enigma that was Jack. For all her regal authority, she seemed almost vulnerable in that moment. "You are unlike any human I have encountered," she admitted softly, her voice barely audible over the resonance. Jack smiled, his tone equally soft. "And you're nothing like any queen I've ever met. Guess that makes us even." The resonance built to a crescendo, the chamber flooding with light and sound. Jack felt the energy surging through him, not just around him but into him, as if the very essence of the process was rewriting something deep inside. He held Zarina's gaze, his grin fading as the intensity of the moment overwhelmed even his irreverent charm. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light dimmed and the hum subsided. The chamber fell silent, leaving Jack and Zarina standing mere inches apart, their hands still joined. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of the experience settling over them. Finally, Jack broke the silence, his voice tinged with both exhaustion and amusement. "So, was it good for you too?" Zarina's regal mask cracked just enough to reveal a flicker of exasperated amusement. "You truly have no limits, do you?" Jack shrugged, his grin returning. "What can I say? I aim to impress." Zarina shook her head, though her glowing cheeks betrayed her once again. The resonance has stabilized, but the connection remains incomplete. Further, synchronization will be required. Jack's grin widened. Synchronization, huh? Sounds like an excuse to spend more quality time together. Zarina's eyes narrowed, though there was a faint sparkle in them that Jack couldn't ignore. "Do not mistake necessity for indulgence, human. This is far from over." Jack leaned in, his voice low and teasing. "Good. I'd hate for this to be a one-time thing." The chamber hummed softly in the aftermath, the energy between Jack and Zarina still lingering like a static charge in the air. Jack, ever the opportunist, broke the silence with a grin that practically radiated mischief. "You know, Zarina, if this is how you do first dates, I can't wait to see what happens on the second." Zarina arched an elegant brow, her regal demeanor flickering as she clearly fought to suppress a smirk. "First dates? You presume too much. This was a matter of survival, not courtship." Jack chuckled, stepping a little closer, though he was careful not to overstep too much. "Hey, I'm just saying, I don't usually get invited into intimate glowing chambers with beautiful queens unless there's a little spark. And I think we can agree we had plenty of sparks." Her violet eyes narrowed, though the faint glow in her cheeks betrayed her once again. "You are insufferable, Jack. Were it not for your unique physiology, I would have thrown you from this chamber long ago." Jack feigned offense, placing a hand over his chest. "Unique physiology? That's a fancy way to say I've got something no one else can handle." Zarina groaned softly, though it sounded more like exasperation than actual frustration. "Your ability to turn every word into innuendo is truly unparalleled." "Thank you," Jack said, bowing dramatically. "I aim to please your majesty. And speaking of pleasing, if we're going to need more of this synchronization, I'm happy to clear my calendar. For, the sake of the galaxy." Zarina stepped back, crossing her arms as she studied him, her expression torn between annoyance and reluctant amusement. "I doubt you understand the gravity of the situation. My people's future depends on this." Jack nodded, his grin softening into something more genuine. "I get it. Big stakes. But hey, if saving your people means spending more time with you, I'm not complaining." The Queen tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And if the process requires greater sacrifice?" Jack smirked, stepping closer again, his tone dipping into that playful edge she had come to expect. "Sacrifice? Zarina, you make it sound like I wouldn't enjoy every second of it." Her cheeks flared brighter, and she turned sharply, attempting to hide the uncharacteristic smile tugging at her lips. "You are incorrigible." And yet Jack said, his voice following her like a teasing whisper, "You keep me around. Must be something you like about me." She didn't answer immediately, but her silence spoke volumes. The chamber's lights dimmed further as the energy subsided completely, leaving the two of them in a quiet intimacy that felt far more intentional than before. Zarina finally turned back to him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. "Perhaps there is." Something she admitted, her voice barely audible. Jack's grin widened, and he placed a hand over his heart dramatically. "I knew it. I'm growing on you. Admit it, Zarina. You'd miss me if I left." Her eyes narrowed, though her lips twitched upward. "Miss you? Perhaps I would miss the peace and quiet." Jack laughed, the sound echoing warmly in the chamber. "Keep telling yourself that, Your Majesty. But next time, let's skip the glowing platforms and go straight to dinner. I hear human cuisine pairs great with intergalactic queens." Zarina shook her head, but the faint glow in her cheeks betrayed her yet again. "You are relentless, Jack." He winked. "Only when it's worth it. And something tells me, Zarina, you're definitely worth it." She sighed, her regal mask slipping entirely for just a moment as she allowed herself a rare, genuine smile. "Perhaps. But do not push your luck, human." Jack shrugged, the grin never leaving his face. "Luck's got nothing to do with it. I'm just that good." As Zarina turned to lead him out of the chamber, Jack couldn't resist one last quip. "So, Queenie, do I get a royal title now? Maybe Champion of Synchronization? Or how about Knight of the Glow?" Zarina groaned audibly this time, her voice carrying a mix of exasperation and amusement. "If you do not cease your endless chatter, I may reconsider throwing you into the void." Jack's laughter followed her down the hallway, his voice ringing with playful confidence. "Admit it, Zarina. You'd miss me even there.